The letter in Samuel Croft's hand promised a strong wife, good for work, and the arrangement had cost him the last of his savings. The paper was brittle, the ink faded by the Nevada sun that beat down on the porch where he stood. He reread the words for the 10th time, though he already knew them by heart. The words were plain: a business transaction brokered by a man in San Francisco who connected homesteaders with immigrant labor. But this was different. This wasn't a hired hand. This was a life, bound to his. The arrangement felt both like a lifeline and a millstone. His farm was a testament to his desperation. 160 acres granted under the Homestead Act, and most of it was dust. The sun had baked the soil into a cracked, pale sheet. His corn stalks were yellow and stunted, their leaves rustling with a dry, defeated sound. The well was low, the barn leaned a few degrees more to the west with every passing season, and the cabin itself was little more than 2 rooms of stubborn solitude. Samuel was a good man, an honest one, but the land was indifferent to honesty. It demanded tribute he did not have to give. He needed help. He needed hands to clear rocks, to dig irrigation ditches, to coax life from the unforgiving earth. But more than that, he needed to not be so completely alone in the fight. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon first, a faint plume against the sharp blue sky. It grew steadily, resolving itself into a single freight wagon pulled by 2 weary mules. This was it. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He had imagined her 100 different ways. He'd pictured a stout woman with broad shoulders and hands already calloused from farm work, someone who would look at his failing land and see a challenge, not a sentence. He had pictured her plain, unsmiling, a partner in labor and nothing more. He had prepared himself for that. The wagon groaned to a halt in front of his cabin, the driver a leather-faced man who didn't bother with pleasantries. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "This is the Croft place?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "It is," Samuel said, his own voice tight. The driver grunted and jerked his thumb toward the back of the wagon. "She's yours, then." "Paid in full." A small figure emerged from beneath the canvas shade. She was not stout. She was not broad-shouldered. She was slight, almost fragile-looking, and she moved with a quiet grace that seemed entirely out of place in this landscape of harsh angles and brutal sun. She was wearing a white prairie dress, the fabric worn thin and clearly made for someone else. It hung on her small frame, the sleeves too long, the waist cinched awkwardly with a piece of twine. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, dark knot, and her face was a mask of calm composure, though Samuel could see the tension in the set of her jaw. She stepped down from the wagon, her eye scanning the desolate farm without a flicker of expression. She carried no luggage save for a small, dark wooden trunk held together with leather straps. The driver tossed it into the dust beside her. Without another word, he cracked his whip over the mules, and the wagon creaked away, leaving the 2 of them standing in a cloud of its departure. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the buzz of horseflies and the sigh of the hot wind. Samuel felt a fool. He had spent his last dollars on a hope, and what stood before him looked like a porcelain doll someone had left in the dirt. She would break under this sun. The work would crush her. He cleared his throat. "Welcome," he said. The word sounded hollow and absurd. She looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable. She gave a small, formal bow, a gesture so alien it only widened the chasm between them. He didn't know her name. The letter had only referred to her as the woman. "I'm Samuel Croft," he offered, gesturing to himself. She watched his lips, then spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, a mere whisper. "My Lynn." "My Lynn," he repeated, testing the sound of it. He pointed toward the cabin. "This is the house." He led her inside. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and living space. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a few cast-iron pots hung from hooks. It was clean but relentlessly spare. He had scrubbed the floors and aired the place out, but there was no hiding the poverty of it. He watched her face for any sign of dismay, of fear, or regret. He saw nothing but that same unnerving stillness. He gestured to the second room, which held his own narrow cot and a small chest. This is my room." Then he pointed back to a corner of the main room where he had placed a second cot, hastily assembled from scrap lumber and a straw-stuffed mattress. "That will be for you." She simply nodded, placing her trunk at the foot of the cot. The finality of the action settled in Samuel's stomach like a cold stone. She was here. This was real. He had yoked this stranger to his own failure. The guilt was a physical thing, pressing on his chest. He had to say something, to explain. He walked to the open doorway and looked out at the parched fields. There's work to be done," he said, more to himself than to her. "The South Levee needs reinforcing. The well needs to be dug deeper before it runs dry." He turned back to her, his hand spreading in a gesture of helplessness. "I don't know if this can be saved. The land." Mai Lin walked to the doorway and stood beside him, her shoulder not even reaching his. She followed his gaze, looking at the withered corn, the cracked earth, the vast, empty sky. She was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her English was halting, pieced together with care. "My father," she began, her voice barely audible over the wind, he said. "You are a good man. But your land is lonely." She turned her gaze from the fields to his face. "He said you needed children." The word hung in the air between them. Samuel stared at her, caught off guard. He had expected to talk of plows and harvests, of work and survival. He had not expected this. He saw not a business arrangement in her eyes, but the echo of a promise made by her father, a promise Samuel felt utterly incapable of fulfilling. He looked back at the desolate land that had consumed his youth and his hope. "Maybe I do," he said, the admission a quiet surrender. "But a man needs a crop before he can think of a harvest." The next morning, Samuel was up before dawn, the habit of a lifetime of work ingrained in him. He expected to find Mai Lin still asleep, exhausted from her long journey. Instead, he found her in the kitchen, a small fire already crackling in the hearth. The scent of something unfamiliar and pleasant filled the small cabin. She had found his meager supply of flour and herbs and was expertly rolling out thin noodles on the table. She had brought her own small cleaver and some dried spices from her trunk. She worked with a focused, economical grace that surprised him. There were no wasted movements. He had lived on salt pork and hardtack for so long that the simple act of a woman cooking in his home felt like a profound change. They ate in silence, the noodles in a savory broth that warmed him from the inside out. It was the best meal he'd had in years. After they ate, he took her outside. He meant to start her on a simple task, something that wouldn't tax her. Weeding the small, struggling vegetable patch, perhaps. But as they stood in the yard, his gaze was drawn to the sky. The air had shifted. It was heavy, thick with a humidity that clung to the skin. The western horizon was bruised with a dark, purplish stain. "Storm's coming," he said, a knot of dread tightening in his gut. A summer storm in these parts wasn't a gentle rain. It was a violent, torrential downpour that could turn the dry creek bed into a raging river in minutes. A flash flood. His eyes went immediately to the South Levee, the earthen wall he'd built to protect his only viable field from that very creek. It was his one hope for a decent harvest. He had noticed erosion along its base for weeks, but he hadn't had the time or the strength to reinforce it alone. It was a job for two men. "The levee," he said, pointing. "It won't hold." He expected a look of confusion or fear from Mai Lin. Instead, her gaze sharpened. She looked from the darkening sky to the earthen wall, and a flicker of understanding crossed her face. Samuel grabbed 2 empty grain sacks and a shovel, his movements hurried. "We have to fill these with sand." "Stack them," he tried to demonstrate with gestures, piling one fist on top of the other. He didn't need to. Mai Lin picked up the second shovel, its handle nearly as tall as she was. She followed him to the sandy patch near the creek bed, and as he drove his own shovel into the earth with brute force, he watched her. She didn't try to match his strength. She used her whole body, leveraging her weight with a fluid precision that was far more efficient. She filled her sacks almost as quickly as he did, her breathing steady, her expression calm and focused. They worked for hours under the increasingly oppressive sky. The wind picked up, whipping dust into their eyes and tearing at their clothes. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to fall, leaving dark spots in the pale dirt. They hauled the heavy sacks to the levee, their muscles straining. Samuel's back ached, and sweat mingled with the rain on his face. He looked over at My Lin. Her thin dress was soaked through and caked with mud, but she didn't slow. She worked with a silent, relentless determination that shamed him. He had judged her by her size, by her fragility. He had been wrong. It was as they were placing the last row of sandbags that the horse appeared. Jedediah Thorne sat atop a magnificent black stallion, looking down at them from the ridge. Thorne was a man who fed on the misfortunes of others. He owned the general store, held the notes on half the homesteads in the valley, and carried himself with the smug assurance of a man who knew the rules were written in his favor. He rode down the slope, the horse's hooves sinking into the dampening earth. He stopped a few feet away, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Working hard, Croft," he called out over the rising wind. "Or is it the wife who's doing all the work?" His eyes raked over My Lin, a look of contemptuous amusement in them. "I heard you'd sent for one. Couldn't find a proper woman to have you, eh? Had to buy one from the railroad camps." Samuel felt a hot surge of anger, sharp and unfamiliar. He was not a confrontational man. He usually met Thorne's taunts with a sullen silence. But this was different. Thorne wasn't just insulting him, he was insulting the woman who was working beside him, fighting for the same patch of dirt. Samuel straightened up, the shovel still in his hand. He stepped forward, placing himself between Thorne and My Lin. "She is my wife," he said, his voice low but steady. "And this is our land. You'll show her respect." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your land? For now. That note is due in a month, Croft. And this little mud wall isn't going to save you. Nothing is." He glanced at the sky. "Enjoy the storm." He spurred his horse and galloped away, his laughter swallowed by the first peal of thunder. The rain began to fall in earnest, a driving, blinding sheet. Samuel and My Lin scrambled to place the final bags as the creek began to swell, its water turning from a clear trickle to a muddy, churning torrent. Finally, it was done. They stumbled back to the cabin, soaked to the bone and shivering. The levee was holding, but the fury of the storm was just beginning. Inside, the small space felt like a sanctuary. My Lin immediately set about building up the fire. As the warmth began to seep back into his frozen limbs, Samuel noticed a long, bleeding gash on his forearm, a gift from a sharp rock he hadn't even felt in the heat of the moment. Before he could tend to it, My Lin was there. She motioned for him to sit, then went to her trunk. She returned with a small porcelain jar and clean strips of linen. With gentle, practiced hands, she cleaned the wound and applied a soothing, herbal salve that smelled of mint and something else, something earthy and clean. Her touch was light but firm, her focus absolute. He watched her, this small, quiet woman who had faced a storm, a bully, and hard labor without a single complaint. He had thought he was acquiring a helper. He was beginning to understand he had found a partner. The rain hammered against the roof, and the wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled. The storm Thorne had promised was still coming, but for the first time, Samuel didn't feel like he was facing it alone. In the days that followed the storm, a new rhythm established itself on the farm. The levee had held, and the field was saved. The rain had replenished the well. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Samuel and My Lin worked from sunup to sundown, rarely speaking, yet communicating through a shared language of labor. He learned to anticipate the tool she would need next. She learned to have a dipper of cool water ready when he paused, wiping sweat from his brow. He discovered she had a knowledge of the earth that was different from his own. He knew about corn and wheat, about brute force farming. She seemed to understand the soil's secrets. She would crumble it in her fingers, studying its texture, its color. One morning, she led him to a rocky, seemingly useless patch of land at the edge of his property. He had always ignored it. She pointed to the ground, then mind digging. With his brawn and her guidance, they spent a week clearing the rocks and tilling the stubborn soil. He thought it was a fool's errand, but he trusted the quiet certainty in her eyes. One evening, after a long day of this new work, they sat at the table in the warm glow of the kerosene lamp. The silence was comfortable now, a shared space rather than an empty one. Mai Lin rose and went to her wooden trunk. She brought back a small, lacquered box. She set it on the table between them and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a letter, its characters a beautiful, intricate dance of ink. Beside it lay several small, cloth-wrapped packets and a thin, well-worn book. She pushed the book toward him. It was a Chinese-English dictionary. For the next hour, she patiently guided him. She would point to a character in the letter, find its equivalent in the dictionary, and then point to the English word. It was a slow, painstaking process. Piece by piece, the story emerged. The letter was from her father. He was, as Thorne had sneeringly suggested, a foreman for the railroad, but he was a man of great standing and respect among his people. He had known Samuel's father, who had once given her father's work crew shelter and food during a brutal winter blizzard when others had turned them away. It was an act of kindness he had never forgotten. He had heard of Samuel's struggles through the network of Chinese workers who passed through the territory. He knew Samuel was a man of his word, like his father had been. He hadn't sold his daughter. He had entrusted her, his only child, to a man he believed was honorable. He wrote that a single post can be broken, but many posts woven together can build a house. He believed that together, she with her knowledge of resilient crops and Samuel with his knowledge of the land, they could build something that would last. Then, she opened the cloth packets. They were seeds. Not for corn or wheat, but for strange, unfamiliar vegetables, bitter melons, winter squash, long beans, and leafy greens he had never seen before. Her father had sent them from his own garden, plants he knew could thrive in difficult, dry soil with little water. They were a gift of survival, a dowry of hope. Samuel stared at the seeds, then at the letter, and finally at Mai Lin. The entire foundation of their arrangement shifted beneath him. He had seen himself as her reluctant master, a man who had bought a helper. He now understood he was a man who had been given a profound trust. He had been so focused on his own hardship that he had never once considered hers, a young woman sent across an ocean to a strange land, to a strange man, armed with nothing but a handful of seeds and a belief in her father's judgment. He finally understood her quiet dignity, her relentless work ethic. It wasn't servitude. It was honor. He looked at the new, tilled patch of earth they had cleared. For these, he said, pointing to the seeds. She nodded, a small, rare smile gracing her lips. They will grow, she said, her confidence absolute. This was the moment he knew their fight was no longer just about saving his homestead. It was about proving her father right. Their small season of hope was shattered 2 weeks later. Samuel was repairing the corral fence when 2 riders approached. One was Jedediah Thorne. The other wore the badge of a territorial marshal. Samuel's stomach went cold. "Croft," Thorne said, dismounting with a smug air of triumph. "Marshal Davies has some paperwork for you." The marshal, a tired-looking man with a weary face, handed Samuel a folded document. It was an official notice of an eviction hearing. "On what grounds?" Samuel asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "The note isn't due for another 2 weeks. Read your contract," Thorne sneered. "There's a land improvement clause. You are required to maintain or improve the value of the property securing the loan. I've filed a complaint that this homestead has fallen into neglect under your tenure. The fences are down, the barn is leaning. It's a clear violation." "That's a lie. We've been working day and night. We saved the South Field." "Your word against mine," Thorne said smoothly. and the marshal has seen the state of your barn. The hearing is in redemption in 2 weeks. The judge will decide. He knew it was a setup. The judge was in Thorne's pocket. The hearing was just a formality before they threw him off his land. He felt the familiar despair wash over him, heavier than ever before. He had failed. He had failed his father's memory, and now he had failed my Lynn. He turned, expecting to see fear in her eyes. She had come out of the cabin and was standing on the porch, watching. But there was no fear. Her eyes were fixed on Thorne with a look of cold, clear-eyed fury. Her chin was up, her back straight. She was not beaten. That night, the weight of their imminent doom filled the small cabin. Samuel sat at the table, his head in his hands. He could run. They could pack what little they had and just disappear, head for California or Oregon. Start over. It was the sensible thing to do. He looked over at my Lynn. She was carefully tending to the seedlings from her father's seeds, which she had started in small clay pots by the window. She treated them with the reverence of a priestess, her touch gentle, her focus unwavering. She was not tending to plants, she was nurturing a future, right here, on this land that was about to be stolen from them. To run would be to betray her. To betray her father's trust. He stood up and walked over to the small chest where he kept his father's things. He pulled out his own copy of the loan document he had signed with Thorne. He smoothed it out on the table beside the lamp. "We will fight," he said. The words felt foreign in his mouth, but they felt right. My Lynn came and stood beside him. She looked at the document, then at him. She nodded once, a sharp, determined gesture. In that moment, they were no longer a homesteader and an immigrant bride. They were partners, united against a common enemy. The odds were impossible. But for the first time in his life, Samuel Croft was not going to back down. For months later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across a farm transformed. The stunted corn was gone, replaced by rows of thriving, unfamiliar plants. Heavy squashes and melons rested on the earth, and trellises Samuel had built were thick with long beans. The air smelled of rich soil and harvest. The leaning barn still leaned, but it now had a new, sturdy roof. A small, well-tended porch, built of fresh-cut pine, now graced the front of the cabin. Inside, the table was laden with food. Samuel sat across from my Lynn, and beside her sat her father, Mr. Way. He was a man whose small stature belied a formidable presence, his eyes sharp and intelligent. The eviction hearing had been their darkest hour. Thorne had presented his case with oily confidence. But when it was Samuel's turn, he did not speak of leaning barns. Instead, guided by my Lynn, he presented the 2 loan documents to the judge, his and Thorne's. Using her dictionary and pointing with a steady finger, my Lynn had shown the judge a single, damning discrepancy. On Thorne's copy, the date of the land improvement clause had been altered with a slightly different ink. It was a forgery, added after the signing. It might not have been enough, but Samuel had taken a desperate gamble. With his last few dollars, he had sent a telegraph to the railroad headquarters, addressed to Foreman Way. Mr. Way had arrived on the morning of the hearing. His testimony, delivered through an interpreter, was devastating. He spoke of Thorne's long history of predatory loans and land grabs, targeting immigrant workers and struggling homesteaders. As a respected foreman for the most powerful corporation in the territory, his word carried immense weight. The judge, facing a potential scandal involving the railroad, had no choice. He dismissed Thorne's claim and opened a formal investigation into his business practices. Thorne's reign was over. Now, sitting at their table, Samuel watched as my Lynn poured tea for her father. She no longer wore the ill-fitting prairie dress. She wore practical trousers and a simple shirt for her work in the fields, but over it, she wore a beautiful blue silk jacket her father had brought her. It was the color of the evening sky. Mr. Way raised his cup to Samuel. "My daughter," he said in clear, practiced English, "she wrote to me. She said the land was not lonely anymore." Samuel looked at my Lynn. A quiet understanding passed between them, a language that needed no dictionary. He thought of the letter that had brought her to him, the one promising her a strong wife, good for work. He kept it on the mantelpiece now, a reminder of how small beginnings could lead to unimagined futures. The letter had promised him a worker. It had given him a partner, a warrior, a home. Later, as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Samuel stood on the new porch, breathing in the crisp autumn air. Mylene came to stand beside him. She handed him a warm cup of tea, her hand brushing his. Her fingers were no longer soft and delicate, they were calloused and strong, like his own. He looked out at their fields, at the visible proof of their shared labor. He finally understood what her father's letter had meant. Children were not just about sons and daughters. They were about legacy, about planting something in the earth that would outlive you. It was about creating a future where there had only been a past. He reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. A home, he realized, wasn't the cabin or the barn or even the land itself. It was the quiet, unbreakable promise two people made to face the storm and the harvest together. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.